Hi, good morning. My name is Whitney Phillips, and I really appreciate you joining us for the Student Data Privacy Spring Training. For today's training, we'll be going over four major topics. One of them is data collection laws, 2, privacy and play, 3, legislative updates, and 4, compliance prep. I'll be starting to talk about data collection. Now, data collection laws are a little different than regular FERPA disclosure laws. FERPA doesn't actually say anything about collection. And because teachers and educators are in positions of power, the federal and state governments have come in and kind of set boundaries of what can be asked of students, what information can be solicited. And so here we have two major laws. We have the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment, that's called PPRA, that's the federal amendment. And then we have what we call Utah FERPA, which is a little bit of a misnomer because what I described before is FERPA is about disclosure. But in this case, Utah FERPA is about collection. And so the main gist of these laws is to ensure transparency and parental rights when you're asking students information that could potentially be sensitive. So what do you have to do? These are the four main things that I'm going to go over today. Number one is have a Protection of Pupils' Rights Amendment policy. And that will go over what pieces need to go in there. That is a federal requirement. Also provide notice to parents of that policy. In some occasions, you would need to collect written parental consent and provide in-service training, because all of these policies and notifications are only as good as the training that you provide your staff and your educators. And so number one, have a PPRA policy. What does this cover? It covers the parental rights to inspect and review materials related to administrations of certain types of surveys, analysis, treatments, evaluations, and physical examinations. This policy, you must provide direct notice of the policy, and direct notice is generally means by hand, by email, or by post. The scope of the policy, this is what should be included, is what are your policies around a survey that is created by a third party? What are your policies around any survey that has marketing for students? And then here's kind of the bulk of what we see is any psychological, psychiatric examination, test, or treatment, or any survey analysis or evaluation that has the evident intended effect of getting students to reveal information about themselves or a family member on one of the 8 sensitive topics. And we'll go over those topics in just a moment. There's also a portion of PPRA that's a little murky for us, to be honest. This was, I believe, written in the 90s, and you're supposed to have a policy on non-emergency invasive physical examinations that involves incision, insertion, injection, or exposure of the body parts. Does not include hearing, vision, or scoliosis screening. I know David and I haven't really come up with many examples of this. So if you can think of one, please share that with us. But you must have a policy on these items. So the 8 sensitive topics are these, and we call these the drug, sex, and rock and roll. Anything that would have to do with those topics that would be somewhat sensitive, something that you might not be able to talk about at Thanksgiving dinner with all family members that you might not all agree with. If there's a gray area, it's best to err on the side of caution. Now, we have political affiliations. I don't want to read these all. Sexual behavior, critical appraisals of who the family member has close relationships with. We also have religious affiliations, beliefs. We also have legally recognized privileged relationships, as with attorneys or ministers, and then income, except required by law. So this information cannot be solicited from students without written parental consent. We'll get into that. So the second thing after having a policy is to provide notice to parents of the policy. The notice should be typically provided annually. However, the Utah FERPA has a few other exceptions. Utah FERPA is a little bit more restrictive than PPRA, but it's kind of the same thing. If you follow Utah FERPA, for the most part, you're following most of PPRA. So the notice must describe instruments that you'll be using over the year. I was a teacher, I was an English teacher, and I didn't know all of the surveys or evaluations that I would be doing at the beginning of the year. And so as the year went on, you would have to provide notice of that. So here we are. The notice must include this information. I don't want to read this to you, but it must say that parents may request the following information, that parents are able to view this, to have copies of it, and to have access to that. So when do you need to provide notice? I spoke to this earlier, at least annually, usually at the beginning of the year, or if you make changes to your policy. So that is the federal requirement. Now the state requirement on top of this is a little more restrictive. This means that you need to give at least a 2-week notice of before administering a psychiatric examination, test or treatment, or a survey, analysis, or evaluation that has the evident effect of soliciting information on those 8 sensitive topics. So in this case, parents can waive that 2-week period of time, but in this case, they need at least 2 weeks generally. So John's gonna put a link in here that we have developed from the federal model, a model notice and consent or opt out for specific activities. This is just a screenshot of the first page. It's a few pages long, but John will put that in the closing documents as well. So you don't need to create all of these things. You can ask us to create it, or we've already created it for you. So the third thing I wanted to mention is this parental consent. Now, PPRA generally says that you need to provide parents the opportunity to opt out of these types of surveys or examinations. However, Utah FERPA requires an opt-in. So it's a little more restrictive. And here we are, we have, we've been asked this question before, what are psychological or psychiatric examination tests or treatments? We have some guidance that comes from the PPRA, not so much Utah FERPA, but we're interpreting that somewhat similarly. You can see here, psychiatric or psychological examination or tests. It's to obtain information that is not really directly related to academic instruction. It's more information about attitudes, habits, traits, opinions, beliefs, feelings. Psychiatric or psychological treatment means an activity involving the plan, systematic use of methods or techniques that are not directly related to academic instruction. And the designed effect is to look at behavior, emotional, or attitudinal characteristics of an individual. So it's not necessarily related to academic evaluation. This is more attitudes, beliefs, opinions. And so here we have also been asked this question, what is a survey, analysis, or evaluation? It's not defined, and PPRA doesn't really define it either. They just say that it should be apparent in everyday English. If you have a question of whether something is defined as a survey, analysis, or evaluation, reach out to us. We are able to answer every question that you have. It usually starts with, it depends, and then we can describe the situation and come up with a conclusion for you. And also this idea, what is evident intended effect? Because on that list of 8 sensitive topics, we have one of them, the first one listed as political beliefs. And I know we learned about political parties, or I did in my US history, US government classes in high school. And those are topics that can be talked about generally, what the political parties are. The idea is when you're trying to get that information from students. For example, asking them who their parents voted for is inappropriate, what political parties their parents are a part of or they're a part of is inappropriate. So here we have a question about if the survey is anonymous, can you get this information? The answer is no. Just because it's anonymous doesn't mean that you do not need parental consent. And this is because some parents and students do not want their students exposed to those sensitive topics. I know that in the news a few years ago, we had a certain high school teacher that was asking students if they had had an abortion. If you can imagine, that was pretty alarming to parents that found out and students, and especially for those that didn't necessarily know that that was possible. So that was kind of shocking to some parents. So be very sensitive of those types of questions. Also, can consent for one activity be applied to another? And I would say, here we say, well, maybe if the parent agrees, but I would say err on the side of caution, have one consent for a specific survey analysis or an evaluation. Can a parent withdraw their consent? Absolutely. They can submit a written withdrawal authorization, which should be respected. And so there's a few exceptions to obtaining or needing written parental consent in order to solicit information about these sensitive topics. One of them is free speech. We see that students, I taught high school, I taught junior high. Students will tell you this information without you asking whether you want to hear it or not. And so anything a student spontaneously says is totally fine. I would say don't, as an educator, follow up and kind of require or ask the student more questions about that sensitive topic. Also, there is an exception that if the student or others are at risk to harm themselves, that these privacy considerations kind of go out the window, but we think that you should intervene as much as your crisis plan suggests, but also to obviously put the safety of that student first. After, let's say, a discussion happens and information is asked of the student, this must be documented. You can see that sometimes if the information is shared with DCFS or DHS, they'll inform the parent, and so that is an appropriate way to have that recorded. But at the school, you would want to report and keep in the record that disclosure of that instance. So we're going to put a few links in the chat here. We have two training modules that I just love. We have a 3-minute training model that is geared towards educators. It's just 3 minutes. And that's David here in the hall of a high school. And he describes what I'm talking about in detail. And then we have David in front of the Utah State Board of Education. This, you can see, that's an almost 7-minute video. This goes over a little bit more of the legalities. This might be interested if you're an administrator. It's just 7 minutes, so I'm hoping that you find it helpful, brief, and accurate. So there's that information. This 3-minute video is included in the educator relicensure course. It's one of the, I think, 12 or 13 modules that we have there. Are there consequences? Well, PPRA says that parents can submit a complaint to the Student Privacy Policy Office. And so this is very similar if parents wanted to file a complaint with FERPA, if their rights have been violated. This means that the U.S. Department of Education will, and I know they will, they look into every single complaint. They will follow up, they'll look into it, and they'll write back an opinion whether it's a violation or not. They can put in sanctions, and they can withhold federal funds for violations. We also have in Utah code here that if an educator violates Utah FERPA, it may result in licensing discipline. So this may be going to UPAC, including a letter of admonishment, letter of warning, reprimand, with or without probation. So there are certain consequences. We feel that educators mean well, but sometimes they are not aware of these laws or these boundaries with students. So thank you for listening to that. I know it's a lot of information. If you have additional questions, please reach out to us. But I wanted to turn the time over to a new employee that you may or may not know, named Katie Chalice. And Katie will be going over a presentation called Privacy in Play. So I'll turn the time over to Katie.
Hey, you guys. Can you give me either a digital or a for real thumbs up if you can hear me okay? And also if you can see my screen that says Privacy in Play. Awesome, thank you. Chrissy, Scott, thanks for doing that. Woohoo, I'm excited. I hesitate to show that because is it obnoxious? Probably, but I am genuinely excited to be here. And I just wanted to say that I think the fact that there are over 100 people here, because I'm new to the team, I feel like I can get away with saying this, but I personally I'm guessing that that's because the team is so amazing. So having known kind of these guys before I began working here, I could tell right off the bat that they were, they're not, do this or else. They're very kind of understanding and supportive of districts and charters. So I am guessing that that's why many of you were willing and interested to join today. So let me just, John, I think John is going to paste this link to the actual slideshow in the chat. So you can follow along if you would like to on the actual slideshow, but you don't have to. And I wanted to just go through a couple of things. Some of these were things that Whitney just said a few minutes ago, but just as a reminder, in this particular session, we're going to be doing a lot of interacting. It's not so much just listening. And so I would love it if you would turn your cameras on if you're comfortable with that. No pressure, but if you're comfortable, cameras on would be helpful for me. And then ultimately we're going to be in breakout rooms, and that will definitely be a benefit for your group members if they can see you. Second, we're going to be using a couple different materials during this session, and John will be pasting links to those materials in the chat. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to set I like to set myself a timer so that I don't go crazy on time. Okay, and then there'll be a Google Doc, a couple of Google Docs, and possibly a little formative assessment tool at the end will be coming your way when applicable. And again, just a reminder, I won't be viewing the chat. So if you needed to say something to me, for example, just know that if you type it in the chat, I won't see it. However, while you're in breakout rooms, I'll try to scan through the chat and see if there's anything we can address when we come back together. Okay, and then finally, I just want to give you an introduction to myself and kind of my background. So I first started teaching in a charter school. So I don't know how many of you are in charter schools. You can give me a thumbs up with the reactions if you want to. So I didn't work in charter schools for very long, but I do feel like I have a little bit of a feel for kind of what that environment is like. And it's particularly the fact that people wear a lot of different hats in a charter school. And there's a lot of overlap in responsibilities. Then for the next 6 years, I worked as a classroom teacher in Tooele School District. I was a science teacher there. And for the last 4 years or so, I worked as an ed tech specialist in that same district. And what's kind of cool about Tooele District is that the ed techs are part of the IT department. That's kind of changed in a lot of school districts where they are kind of moved to the teaching and learning department. But In our case, we were still a part of IT. And so I loved that I had this ability to really collaborate with our IT folks. And I'm hoping, I believe, and I hope that it's true that because of that background that I can be better able to help you guys in your roles. I know some of you are IT directors and others of you are kind of the data stewards in your LEAs. And I'll just give a shout out to Tamara Cummings from my district. In that role, I was able to work with her quite a bit. So I very much look forward to working with this group. Also shout out to Alan Hansen. He was our information security officer. So I anticipate that this will be, I hope to have good relationships with you guys, and I really hope that you will feel comfortable reaching out to me directly. I would personally really benefit from getting to know you. And there in the closing doc that these guys, that John will post and explain at the end, there's some contact information for us. So if you're ever interested in training from any of us or just to reach out with questions, all our contact information will be in there. All right, so here's the outline for today. I want to first go through our objectives for today, and then we're going to talk about these different scenarios. That's the main goal of this session. We've created a document for you called Privacy Principles that will kind of guide you through evaluating the scenarios we look at today. The bulk of our time will be spent on one scenario in particular, and this is because the discussion behind this tends to be very rich. And I'll give you some instructions for that. Like I said, you'll be in breakout rooms for probably 15 minutes, possibly a little bit longer if the discussions are still going strong, which I anticipate they probably will be based on what we've kind of tried out in the past. And then we'll come back together for a whole group discussion. If we have time, I'm not certain that we will. We might do a mini scenario or two, and then we'll wrap it up. So let's start with objectives. One of our main goals for you in this session is to allow you to network with folks around the state. So if you're like me, then sometimes in conferences you meet folks and they've got this great idea, or, oh, we're doing it this way. So I hope you will take advantage of the fact that you're going to be talking with a smaller group of people in your breakout room and jot down their contact information. We want you to take a few minutes to introduce yourselves. So that is a high priority. That's not a side objective. That's something we want you to make a priority today. Secondly, we're going to just practice taking these kind of abstract laws and putting them into practice. And having just started in this position, I can tell you that the abstract aspect of these laws is very fresh on my mind. So I think this will be kind of fun to take it and turn it into a real scenario. And then also we'll address some misconceptions when we come back together as a whole group. All right, so let me give you an intro to this document that you're going to be using as a part of the activity. This document doesn't contain all of the different concepts that are included in the privacy world. However, we've kind of put a few in here that are specifically applicable to the scenarios that you'll see today. And so your task will be to use this document in combination with your kind of own reasoning to evaluate the scenario, rather than just kind of trying to go based on memory necessarily or your gut feeling. This document, just so you know, is made of primarily principles pulled from law, either state or federal. But we also have this little memo at the top that I think is an excellent lens through which to view privacy questions. And that is living by the rule of trying to maximize student benefit and minimize student harm. So these are kind of the tools you'll use to evaluate the scenarios that you're given. Okay, here we go. If you are in a situation where you can't participate, so I'm hoping that's a small-ish number of you, but for example, if you're working at the front desk and you need to be able to answer the phone or whatnot, these instructions are for you. So what we'd like you to do is you'll go ahead and join the breakout room that we put you in, and you can just listen in. But you need to give your group a heads up that you won't be speaking, otherwise they really won't know what's going on. They might just think you're thinking for a long time. And I'll just say, if you happen, I don't expect this to be the case, but if you happen to be in a group that has a very small, or has no one else that is able to speak, or even if you had two and you wanted to be in a group of bigger than two people that were able to speak together, feel free to leave the main session And there's a little leave button when you're in your breakout room. It's blue. You can leave the breakout room and come back to the main session. And Jessica and David will help you get put into a different room. Again, I don't anticipate that's the case, but just so you know, that's an option if you get stuck in a room that doesn't really have folks who are able to talk. Okay, logistically, you're going to be, once you're in your breakout room, you're going to be balancing these 3 different tabs or windows. You'll need your Zoom window open, but you'll also be using this privacy principles document that we just talked about for reference. And finally, you'll have this third document, or this third tab open, which is the scenario 1 document. This is a collaborative document that every single one of you will be viewing at the same time, and we'll all have editing rights too. So as with any collaborative document, just make sure you're careful not to, delete other people's work or whatnot. And John is going to paste, if he hasn't already, I'm not sure, I wasn't paying attention. He's going to paste the link to these 2 documents in the chat. Okay, this is the last slide of instructions, and then I'll let you actually get to work. I want you, like I said, to make it a priority to introduce yourselves, tell people your name, and especially what is your role and where do you work? So you might be a data manager, but what else are you? Like what's your primary job title? And then you're going to find your group page on this document. I want to kind of walk you through this process. So I'm going to actually open the document. Okay, so here we are. What you'll do is when you get in here, and your breakout room's open, you'll notice that the top of your breakout room window will say Zoom room number. That's different from what you're seeing at the top of your window right now. But once you're in your breakout room, that number will appear. That is your room number. So this one says 1, that means I'd be in group 1, and I would then click this guy to go to the group 1 page. If I was in group 18, I would click this and go to the group 18 page and type here so I'm not typing over other people's work. Your task then will be to read this scenario, and then we've given you a handful of questions down here at the bottom. And I believe this will be a really interesting discussion for you. You're going to want to, like I said, use the privacy principles document to kind of guide you through what you think is the best way to answer these questions or to approach this scenario. Okay, so let's see. All right, and then you're going to, oh, whoops. Oh, I'm sorry. I just realized that's an old slide. Okay, then you're going to, oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. Here we go. You need, we're going to give you 13 minutes to start with on that, plus the 2 minutes to introduce yourself. However, we're going to add 5 minutes if needed. There's a little thing that we can like a message to everyone, and it pops up at the top of your window. So if you want to keep your Zoom window open, you can watch for these little messages. We'll probably be sending out a little message that says, hey, we're going to add another 5 minutes. If that sounds painfully long to you, just trust me that the time will fly when you get talking about this. And in the event that you finish early, if, in the rare chance that you do, go ahead and just click that leave room button in the bottom corner, and then you come back to the main session. Okay, so Jessica's going to open the breakout rooms for us. I'm going to be just popping around from room to room, and if you see me, just ignore me. I'm just listening in just to kind of see how things are going. Ready to go. Are we all back in? Okay, awesome. Well, hey, I sure had fun listening to your discussions. I only got into a couple of the different rooms, but very interesting stuff. I am especially curious to kind of know how things operate logistically in some of your different districts or charters, and we'll get into that a touch. Because I have access to your Google Doc, I'm actually gonna kind of scroll through this document, and I found a couple of things that I wanna ask people about. And so I've got a spokesperson listed here, so I'm just gonna ask that spokesperson to unmute themselves and kind of answer the question I have for you. So I was wondering if someone could, let's see. Yep, this is a big one that came up over and over again. What to do if the parent truly had opted out? No, you know what? I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's first talk about the privacy principle. So a couple people that I read through said directory information. A few said parent rights. I'm going to ask for a volunteer on this one to just unmute yourself and share with us which privacy principles did you select, and just a brief explanation of why. So if you're comfortable sharing your thoughts, go ahead and unmute yourself and speak up.
This is Joby Wright from SCDC. I'll jump in if that's okay.
Yes,
So
please.
we actually thought it was a couple of these. We thought it was both a parent right principal question and a directory information. So privacy principle 2 and privacy principle 3 for this one.
Interesting. What about parent rights in particular?
So the option of opting out and understanding that they retain that right throughout the school year. Just because they didn't opt out at the beginning during registration doesn't mean that they can't opt out at any point during the school year.
Interesting. So that kind of ties back to that. I think it was the second question that says, does the parent truly have the right? I actually want to talk about this, not because I don't anticipate that this would change your answer of how to address it. I saw a lot of consistency with what you were saying the principal should do. However, it is interesting to note that in the directory information opt-out, the LEA gives the parent a time frame and like a due date essentially. That's like, hey, you can let us know within the first month of school or something like that. And then basically the idea is like, after that, sorry parent, you didn't opt out. Now in practice, that's probably not great because that would make a lot of parents angry. but the law says that they need to opt out within that time frame. David.
Yeah, if I can add on to that, because I jumped in one of the groups and we talked about that a little. So yeah, the requirement is, within whatever your directory information policy is, that parents are notified, and you give them a date. And I think that date, the idea really is, this is your last chance before we can guarantee that we won't release directory information, because you're going to start having football games, you're going to start having choir concerts, and all kinds of directory disclosures. And so I've seen some LEAs, they have it as soon as like the first day of school, where they say, you have to let us know in writing by then, or we can't guarantee that we can honor any directory information opt-out requests. With that said, I have seen other LEAs that have it as a policy that, we will accept requests at any time in the year in writing. That's another valid option. But as to the question of, does the parent have the right? It really is, what is in your policy? What did you tell them, and are you following through with it? Now, in this particular case, I think the question of whether they have a right or not is maybe a little silly, because it's like 5 seconds of work. Just take it down. Just be nice and ask. But from the legal point of view, I think it is good to emphasize, the importance of, were they notified, and did they, what is the time frame you're giving them, and where do you go from there?
Yeah, thanks, David. And you're right. I think context is important here. A website, it's super easy to just take the name down. But yeah, like legally, if a kid's name was printed in like the choir concert program, and the parent had been notified but hadn't opted out in the time frame provided, then like you wouldn't, legally there wouldn't be an argument to be made against you. But obviously, I think everyone recognizes that's not the only issue in question here. Is a big part of it is relationship with parents and trusting that parents have their kids' best interest in mind. I was curious to know, were there any groups that selected principle number 1 as one of the principles that apply? And if so, go ahead and unmute yourselves, please.
Yeah, I'm part of group 9, and we did select principle number 1, 2, and 3, because as we looked at it, we really felt like it did affect, because this was something that was very much a student benefit, a celebration of that student. And there was a minimizing of student harm, in that it didn't have any pictures of the students or any of the other things that could potentially be a bigger issue. With that being said, obviously it's an easy fix, but we don't feel like the teacher should stop what she's doing altogether.
Oh, interesting. Including including the practice of putting student names on there. Is that true?
Yeah, we felt like you could still do it with just first names. Should be fine. And for any student that, doesn't have an opt-out form, and even if there was the potential where you had students that had the same first names, even potentially the last name, just the initial of the last name, might be something that's not as inflammatory or get some people upset. It might be tougher to identify who that student is by an outsider.
Interesting. Yeah, if I could speak to that a little further, I think one discussion that we often have on our team is this difference between an intellectual reaction to a scenario and a visceral reaction. And I believe, especially, like in my own experience, and then also kind of bouncing around from room to room, that it's quite common to say, oh, easiest solution to this is just don't do it. And that is sometimes the best answer. And I personally, like if I were a classroom teacher, I would probably go that route just out of pure fear. I would probably not post student names. But I do think that top one is important to consider. And the fact that the parents and the students found the site to be very meaningful and beneficial, assuming that also extended into their classroom culture, specifically if it was an elementary school is often the case, that could be something to kind of weigh. And perhaps you could find a middle ground of first names rather than just cutting the practice altogether. That being said, I think that's an LEA decision. And at the very least, you would want to make sure that you don't include those students that have opted out of directory information. Okay, so any other comments on the principals? Actually, no, I'm not even going to give you oh, Holly, you unmuted yourself. Go.
Oh, what? Oh, yeah. Yeah, just a quick comment on number one. This really truly is our guiding principle. And that is, it's not always about FERPA. It's not always about the law. It literally is about getting as little student information out there while still accomplishing the goal. So we want to do really great things with these apps. We want to do really great things with celebrating students. There's no reason to have a last name there. It serves no purpose. The teachers can, or the parents can recognize the kids' names by the first name. Oh, hey, that's my kid. Last initial if you need to. But this way, we are not putting anything out that we don't have to. We're still accomplishing our educational goal.
I love that, Holly. I want to just hug you because I do think that's important. And I think it's easy when, especially when we're talking about the law, to get kind of lean in the other direction of like, no, kind of rather than focusing on how can we accomplish the same goal while also protecting students. Awesome. I do want to hear from a couple of you. Oh,
Robert.
Robert.
Hey, I just want to chime in a little bit on this. I love the idea of recognizing the students. And in this scenario, even David in the chat says, can we do it other than having a public facing website? And, for our district, we use Canvas. And Canvas gives us that same way of recognizing the student. All of the students and all of the parents can have access, but it's not public facing. And because of that, it makes it a lot easier to keep those things more legit. Yes, we are sharing this with other parents of this course, but it's not anyone in the world. And so at least it narrows that field down. And I'd like to know if that's what David was thinking, or if that's even a question mark there, if we need to be careful even with Canvas, because there are then other parents that can see it.
Well, yeah, and if I can just address that, because you did ask me. I mean, I think it really just comes back to, what is in this principle one, and also what Holly said was, like the minimizing student harm is like, who's the least number of people we can share this out with? Potentially anyone who has an internet connection might find this teacher's website if it's, just a website that's public facing versus ones that are just within the school community or just within the class community. And I think these are, again, we're getting beyond the legal question, because like if it is just directory information, the answer is you can do whatever you want. You could release it on, a public facing website and you're within your legal obligations. But I think it is helpful in these cases. I really like just the way Holly framed it, of like, what's the least we can get out while maximizing the students' benefit and recognition. And I think those are just helpful questions to ask. And there's not necessarily one right answer in this case, because we're not, you know, we're already saying like, well, you could do it lots of ways and it would be legal. And I think it's good to look at like your local culture, you know, the way they do things in Box Elder, you know, where that's, you know, might be smaller, more tight-knit communities compared to, you know, Holly and Jordan, where it's, you know, these massive suburbs. You might come up with different answers, but I think it's good to, you know, here's what we legally can do. And then let's also ask ourselves, well, what's the least we can share out while still, you know, honoring the awesome things that students do.
So Dave, can I just comment on that? Because some of us are old enough that our only value is being old, right? I like the idea of do no harm. There's a case that's kind of famous now from years back where a young mother who had a couple of kids in another state that was heavily involved in gangs decided to take a risky, daring move and run away, move to a conservative state that we might know, work 3 jobs, build a new life for her and her kids in this new place. Along came the internet, and a teacher who hadn't really considered any of this posted those kids online. And within 3 days, someone drove from that other state, met those kids at school. They were so excited to see their long lost parents, gathered them up to go get an ice cream, and that just happened to be in the other state. And then that mother and the state office of ed were involved in a 3 or 4 year extradition legal proceeding. Whether or not it's legal, those kids' lives were severely damaged by that event. And I think we need to have that first rule always in the back of our head. Do no harm to the child wherever possible. And we absolutely want to respect the parent's right to be anonymous, in my opinion.
I love that. I'm really glad you said that. In fact, interestingly, like several people on our team have personal experiences with needing information to be kept private. So you're right, the maximizing the student benefit could be partly like recognizing that students benefit from recognition, but that danger of publishing something that someone is desperately wanting to not be publicly facing, that's a real danger, and it's probably a bigger factor to consider. Thanks for bringing that up. That's very important. Well, we're almost out of time. The one thing I did want to do though is many of you said in your you know, there were those 2 questions of like, well, how could you prevent this from happening in the future if the parent truly had opted out? And that is the one I am most interested about. So true confession, as a classroom teacher, I did not understand directory information. I knew the photo thing. So, but even then I wasn't really sure which students had opted out of having their photos shared. So I was blatantly unaware of which students of mine their parents had opted out of sharing directory information. Could I get a couple of folks speak out to that and tell us how you're doing it in your LEA? I'm especially curious how you're doing it in secondary schools where these teachers have sometimes 200 students. If you're comfortable, go ahead and unmute yourself and share.
In our group, I'm Amanda, I'm with group 15. And I really liked Robin had made a suggestion that you put a flag in your SIS so that teachers can see that flag and know the student, you can't share directory information on the student. And so I think we're going to try to come up with something like that. I thought that was a great suggestion.
I completely agree. We used Aspire in Twila, and there's a way to go in. I learned this now in my current job. There's a way to view a student's directory information status based on, like, if you click into their profile. But if you're viewing like a student roster, which is primarily what teachers do, right? They would need something like that, a flag. So I love that. And Amanda, if you pursue that and you have movement on that, we would love to hear about it so we could kind of pass along the good word to others. Anyone else want to share what they're doing to get that information out to the teachers?
I'm just going to volunteer Troy, who was in our group 8. They have something like that in their district. Troy, would you like to speak?
I guess certainly I like to speak. similar type of thing. In Power School, our Power School administrator has the ability to use certain tools to create alerts that appear on the student's record. And we have an alert that appears on the student's record if a parent has signed an opt-out form. The real challenge here is to make sure that everybody's educated on what that means, to be looking for it, and that there is a process that follows through. Because if everybody believes that flag or that alert in the student record is the piece that tells you whether or not you can or cannot share that information, and that doesn't make it in there, or something is disabled or not enabled as it should be, then it all breaks apart. And so even more critical than that is just making sure that you have an overall process that everybody is aware of, everybody is educated on how to use, and you reinforce that constantly so that you can use those kinds of tools and operations to help manage that.
Troy, thank you. That is very cool. So I didn't know that. In Power School, you as an admin have the ability to kind of utilize some of those tools. Very awesome. I'd be curious to know, we won't talk about it now, but I would be curious to know kind of what some of the other SISs allow for in terms of customability like that. Just so you know, there is in the October check where we kind of check for, ask you for those evidences that you've done in the past. We're going to ask some kind of survey questions that are more just for us to, I call it, quote, intel gathering. So watch for questions like that, because I just want to kind of get a feel for what different LEAs are doing in terms of getting that information out there. How are you keeping track of it in your SIS? Are you breaking it down by like photos versus other information? So we'll ask you to answer some questions like that in the fall. My contact information is also on the closing document, but again, please reach out. I'm anxious to meet you guys and get to know you better. Oh, Holly, you raised your hand.
Did. So I learned something recently that your shared Google Docs, if you don't set them to private, can be accessed by the public. And so someone could create a Google Doc and someone else who has it shared with them eventually can go in and change that setting. And so you run into a situation where if you're doing a Google Doc, you really do have to be careful that the setting itself isn't outward facing, or else the public will now have access to everyone who just said they don't want to be in student directory information, and now all of their names are listed, and that won't make them happy. So.
Whoa. Okay, I'll have to get more information from you about that. It sounds like you learned it from experience. Is that true?
I'll just leave it there. Not personal experience, but I'll leave it there.
Okay. Well, thank you, you guys. This is, for me, I've just had a blast. I hope you benefited from this. And thanks for being patient. We went a couple minutes over 45 minutes. But next, you have the great honor of hearing from David. So I'll stop sharing my screen.
Well, thanks, Katie. The honor is all mine. I'm going to be doing the last two sessions as we kind of round this out. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the legislative session that closed in March. And I will say, so for those who aren't aware, our section heavily follows each legislative session, looking at every single education law, or sometimes laws that just have to do with government operations, and try and consider, what is the impact going to be on, especially, to the LEAs, to all of you, is there going to be extra work you're going to have to do to achieve student privacy? And I'll also say, for those who, we might have reached out to during the session, there are some bills we might have sent and said, like, hey, what do you think the impact of this would be? How would it make your life, difficult or better or something like that? And in many cases, particularly the ones that are difficult, they didn't pass. So I want to start with that I'm going to go over the bills that did pass. So there might have been some that you heard about, that didn't pass. Those won't be covered here. And honestly, the ones I am going to talk about right now are really not kind of tangential, I guess, is what I'm getting at. Like you'll see these first ones in a moment. So like attendance data collections. Now you might be aware, you're supposed to provide a notice to parents annually in our state law of the types of data you're going to collect on students. And so I flagged this one because anything that deals with data collection saying, you can collect information or can't, I just thought everyone should be aware of. And so there were two bills that passed related to attendance data. The first one, HB 81, there's a section of code that lists valid excuses for an absence. And this one previously did include, I believe, time that a student might need to take off for mental and behavioral illness. So, if they were like actively, for lack of a better word, sick, this amendment allows for just mental and behavioral health. So kind of like you can just have a mental and behavioral health day. It's pretty vague in that regard. And I think similar to your other attendance collections, you don't need to mark anywhere special. It's not like, oh, now you need to collect that the student has depression or something like that. But it was more just for your awareness that this is, there's a new valid excuse for an absence. On the other side, HB 116, student attendance amendments, basically says you may no longer require doctor's notes to excuse absences. And the representative who introduced this bill, he talked about moving to Utah and like the flu went through his family and the doctor insisted on seeing each individual in his family, family of like 5 or 6, seeing them each separately, and most importantly, billing them all separately. And yeah, he just looked at like the costs of going to see a doctor, particularly in a large family where, something as simple as the flu or something like that might be going through, and didn't feel like it was really equitable for parents who might be lower SES to require them to have a doctor's note for any sort of medical thing. With that said, they did talk about in many of the discussions, the school still, particularly in long-term cases where, let's say, a student due to a medical issue has to be out a month or 2 months, that the parent might provide documentation to be able to help facilitate continuing the student's education. It's just really that you can't require documentation to excuse absences. So you might still collect it, just not require it. Okay, we talk a lot about student safety and data sharing that might be involved with that. HB 345 relates to student resource officers and had a lot to do with ensuring that they all received a certain standard of training. And one of the lines in the bill that relates to privacy, but generally not in a FERPA way that we think of, since FERPA, again, is very concerned with records, talked about student privacy and training SROs regarding the legal parameters for searching and questioning students on school property. What is this going to look like exactly? I am not sure, but there is a bill that says SROs have to be trained on this. And I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, the bill is going to have USBE put together some training materials. I'm not sure how those will be distributed within LEAs, but so the point is, just right now, there's a line in a law that says that this will be a privacy issue, and also just SRO trainings in general are going to be expected in the future. There were 2 bills relating to oversight. HB 243 was a major privacy bill for all government entities, so at the state level and at local levels. It is basically creating 3 different oversight entities. There's this one called the Government Operations Privacy Officer, who is going to be focused on privacy oversight of executive branch state agencies. There is going to be a personal privacy oversight commission that is going to be made up of a variety of individuals, some appointed by the governor, some appointed by the state auditor, and then a state privacy officer who will be focused on pretty much everything else, other state agencies that aren't executive branch and local agencies. So potentially that could include LEAs in schools. Another bill, Senate Bill 160 State Audit Amendments, authorizes the Office of the Legislative Auditor General, or OLAG, to perform appropriations audits, and it specifically says of executive agencies and local education agencies. So basically, I mean, when it says appropriation audits, a lot of this had to do with kind of the idea that the legislature, you know, they're allocating funds and they want to be able to have their own independent verification of how those funds are used. Now, would that necessarily relate to student data? I'm not sure, but it's a possibility with all of these. I don't think any of these are necessarily specifically saying like we are going to target LEAs. But one of the things I did want to say is at the state level, because as you're aware, and I'm going to talk about it actually in just a few minutes, annually we review every LEA's status of complying with the different policies and notices that are required in federal and state law. In 2019, the state auditor's office got the idea to do the exact same with school districts around the same time I was doing it. So there was no coordination. And I think a lot of LEAs felt frustrated by this, that, you know, there were basically two government agencies asking for the same thing at the same time. And so that is one of the thoughts, you know, I certainly have is, you know, going back again, where it's like, we want to make sure that, you know, ultimately students, they're receiving maximum benefits from the schools, that information we're collecting is, you know, being treated securely, and we're trying to honor the students' privacy in as much as we can, but that recognizing that this often requires a lot of oversight. And as the state is creating these new entities and giving different authorities to groups like OLAG, that at the very least, you know, our team wants to be sensitive of that in terms of how we run things. You know, I just don't want there to be another situation where, say, this state privacy officer was looking heavily into LEAs for whatever reason, that we would want to coordinate with them instead of having, you know, two audits occurring at the same time. And also within that vein, there were several bills, I believe it was mostly from Representative Pulsifer from South Jordan, relating to this idea that we are just asking so darn much of our LEAs. And we need to take a step back and look at like all the, and specifically in this case, all the reporting requirements. And so the bill, you can see on the right, these are the things that USB has been tasked to do for all the reporting requirements that state law or board rule requires LEAs. We need to essentially document a rationale for them. What is the purpose? Is it effectively achieving that purpose? Could this purpose be achieved in some other way? Is this the least burdensome way we could do this? I'm sure many of you are aware of and possibly involved with the USIMS development, which is hopefully going to make our data exchanges more interoperable. Could, you know, this report eventually be, you know, integrated into USIMS so it's less work, and also needing to estimate times and costs for these reports. Now, I say this from the privacy point of view because our state privacy law does require, I think, certain reporting. Something like the metadata dictionary, which I'll talk about in a moment, is effectively a report. Even the annual reporting of your compliance is also a report. This isn't to say that these things are going to go away, but that we are going to be taking a good hard look at them. And I think certainly the estimating time and costs is going to be something that all of you can really help us with. You know, we sometimes get, you know, at USB, it's very easy for us to just look at the law and say, you should be following this law. And we don't always see, you know, the amount of time it's taking you to put something together, what work you're not able to do from one of your other many hats because this report is being asked of you. And really, I think it's just, you know, the legislature wants to make sure that we're just being as efficient as possible. Again, it's all coming back to that goal of we're maximizing benefit and minimizing burden. So those are the bills I felt like were the most relevant to discuss right now as it relates to privacy and LEAs. So with that said, we're going to close this out by previewing. As you're aware, right now in board rule, every October, there are certain elements that we ask LEAs to submit to us for review to make sure that, as I said earlier, you know, that you have all of the policies and notices that are required by federal and state law. We call this the annual privacy compliance check or the October 1 check, something like that. So we thought this would be a good time to talk about you know, what we're going to expect for this coming October. This is going to be a lot of information. I'm just going to say up front that we will have this documented elsewhere in a lot more detail with a lot more guidance on how to follow stuff. So right now I just say, you know, just listen. This is meant to be kind of high level. But then that in the coming weeks and certainly in future newsletters, we will have more detailed information for you. So first of all, our board rule right now lists certain elements that need to be collected. We need to know each year who is in charge of data privacy. So who is the data manager and who's in charge of security, who's your information security officer. Under FERPA, there are 2 notices that are required. That would be your annual notice and the directory information notice. Our state law requires a data collection notice, a data governance plan, a metadata dictionary. The board rule also, in order to essentially interpret what are considered reasonable data industry best practices, we have said that LEAs need to adopt a cybersecurity framework, which by default, unless you want to be more do something else, should be the CIS controls. And that's largely based on a recommendation from UETN, since they use the CIS controls when conducting on-site audits and pen tests and those sorts of things. Now, the board rule, mostly out of omission, doesn't mention PPRA and Utah FERPA, which Whitney talked about earlier. So even though it's not in the rule, in our survey that we're going to have go out, we'd like to check this as well. So I'm framing this as more of out of the goodness of our hearts. It's not required by the rule, but it is required by federal and state law that you have these policies. So we figured while we're checking stuff that we would ask for it as well. But I just did want to make clear that it is technically not in the rule. And I think basically what that means is, you know, if you don't give it to us, I'm probably not going to hound you down as much. Be like, hey, where is this? Although again, you know, we want everyone to be compliant. So it's more with that thought in mind. So I want to talk over each of those elements and explain how we're going to check it and what we're looking for. So in the case of contact information, we actually find it most helpful to have well before October. At the beginning of the school year, so sometime in August, we intend to reach out to every LEA via email and just have you confirm, are you still the person? Are you still the data manager? Are you still the information security officer? So much of our communications, our newsletter, letting you know that we're doing these kinds of trainings is based on knowing who you are. So that will be one of the first things to expect at the beginning of the school year, is just trying to get that confirmation. Annual FERPA notice, we checked this last year. For those who haven't maybe heard of this, FERPA grants parents 4 specific rights: a right to inspect and review records, to seek amendment of records, consent to disclose records, and to file a complaint with the U.S. Department of Education. So we would expect to see all of those in your annual FERPA notice. It also needs to explain how you determine who is a school official with legitimate educational interest. Those are the 2 things I've generally checked in the past. For this year, it is not technically required to be in the annual FERPA notice, but FERPA does require you to notify parents one way or another how you will handle transferring records in cases where a student is transferring schools. You can do this on a case-by-case basis, or FERPA says it can be in the annual FERPA notice. Since it most likely is in the notice, we figured we would check it there. But I'm specifying here also, it's It's optional. You don't have to have it there. You could just let parents on a transfer by transfer basis know, what your policy is. But we figured since most of you will have it, we'll check and make any comments on it there. Similarly, because when you think directory information, I think AWACS in the US Air Force. We obviously talked a lot about directory information in Katie's scenario. This needs to include the items you've designated as directory information, a process for opting out, and the timeline for opting out. One of the things that is often in there also, though, especially if you are using the US Department of Education's model document, relates to these disclosures made to recruiters, either military recruiters, hence the airplane, and recruiters from institutions of higher education. This is only a requirement. They only ask for it for schools that have students who are in 11th or 12th grade. So we were going to look at that for that as well, just to see, if you have it, and if so, provide comments on that. I would see it honestly, for those of you who have, done this a couple of times, similar to like the directory information one, where some of you have directory information policies that don't include all the information you could have as directory information. So, it wasn't like I didn't pass you. You could receive a pass without it, but I made a comment where it was like, hey, you could have more elements, just something to think about. It would probably end up being a similar comment of, I don't see anything here about the recruiters. You have to have that someplace else. This is one of the best places to put it. And then just kind of work from there. Student data collection notice. So this is, this hasn't changed at all. This has been in the Utah Student Data Protection Act. It needs to be a prominent standalone document, state the data you're collecting, state data you won't collect. There is a prescriptive, it is an exact sentence regarding parent benefits, risk, and choice. It needs to generally describe how you protect student data and state the student rights under the Student Data Protection Act. We have a template for this. If you've been using that, that meets the requirement. Data governance plans also have not had any changes to the requirements, but they do need to describe reasonable data industry best practices to maintain, protect data, describe roles and responsibilities, provide for technical assistance, training, support, audit, describe how you share student data, describe the process a parent could follow to expunge data, describe how you will respond to a data breach, and ultimately also be posted on your website. PPRA Utah FERPA policy. This is one we haven't talked about a lot, but again, Whitney talked about it a little. This policy, and this is in federal law, needs to cover how you will handle parental inspection of survey and other instructional materials. That's the third bullet, so I just skipped that. Opt-in and opt-out rights, handling administration of physical examinations and screenings, and marketing survey administration as well. And if you are doing any of those, you're also supposed to not just have a policy, but provide notice at least annually to parents. And under Utah law, if it hits on one of those protected categories, within 2 weeks of providing it, that will describe your policy, describe the opt-in, opt-out procedures, and also needs to give notice of specific events. I think under the federal law, if you look at, and we have an example from the Department of Ed, they kind of expect like just a calendar at the beginning of the year where it's like, and in March, we'll be giving this, and in February, there will be this. If you are aware of those, we also, wanted to see what is happening. Okay, let's talk about how we're going to do this whole thing, because typically in the past it's been, I let you all know about it, and then in the beginning of October you submit, and I spend the entire month looking through it. Since so many of you honestly have passed a lot of these main elements in the past, we didn't feel like just doing it all in October really made sense. Plus, I will say, so Katie, we see her as being not just kind of taking over Greg's old role. For those who remember Greg, may he rest in peace. He didn't die. We just talk about him that way. We'll be doing a lot of the training stuff, but we'll also be working a lot on this compliance review. So we kind of think of it as, she'll see what's going on and then base training materials on, what's happening and what is really needed. So it'll kind of inform a cycle that way. So we actually plan to start this over the summer, particularly for those of you who got passes last year. So we're just going to go through and look and see, well, is what we signed you off on last year still there? You know, if you received a pass, you know, is the link still there? Because again, so much in our state law requires there to be a valid URL. And if there's something that is off, then, you know, we'll reach out to you and let you know, hey, you know, maybe you redid your website, we can't find this anymore. But if it's still there and still looks good, we'll let you know. And well before October, you will get a pass on it for 2021. Now, if last year there were elements that were listed as partial or missing, we plan to start reaching out to you a little earlier, sometime in the next coming weeks, sometime in the spring, to start being like, hey, like October is kind of more of the due date. What can we do now to, you know, get those plans, those policies, those notices updated so that that can be passed off and something you don't have to worry about. Okay, one that is in board rule and that we haven't been able to check largely because the tool that you were required to use has been broken is the metadata dictionary. We have changed our board rule to basically just say, you know what, you don't have to use our tool, it's broken anyway. Anything that meets the requirements, then is posted on your website, gets a pass. So the legal requirements are you need to define the PII you collect and disclose, and you need to have a listing of recipients of student PI, and that needs to include some sort of privacy analysis, usually a justification for sharing the PII and how it's legally permitted under FERPA, which mostly just means, you know, share the exception under FERPA, which I think in most cases is probably going to be school official. So that's what we want to see. And we recognize that this could be, depending on all the data sharing happening in your LEA, could be a massive undertaking, especially if, you know, teachers are doing stuff without telling you. So we believe it's reasonable that by October, so when we check it this year, that any disclosures that you are aware of, we're basically saying at the district level, and if it's a charter school, things that have been approved at the administration level. So ones that you all would be aware of. So that's basically the expectation we're hoping for. I think to be fully compliant, you will need to go beyond that, but we don't think that that's entirely reasonable by this October to figure out how you will do that. So here is specifically what we're going to look for. The law says it has to be posted on your website. So we're going to ask for a hyperlink that takes us to it, or that also, I mean, it could just be the page where it says, and here is the link. We will make sure that that link is active. And I do want to say, because I know a lot of you have websites that are posting to that data gateway one, you haven't been able to enter information in there for the past 3 years. We are not intending to keep it up to update it at any time. So if that is what your link is to, we'd like you to change it. And then we'll also go in and just, you know, try and see if it looks reasonable that this is all the recipients that you would know about at your district level. We do intend to, for those of you who are part of the DTL grant, go through your DTL grant application to see, you know, if you said, we're going to spend this money to get Lexia, you know, then we would expect to see Lexia there. We're gonna try and do our best to see if this looks right, but that's about what we're going for there. Is we want to see something on your website, link works, and that the list appears to be about right. So with that said, you might not be aware. So there's this thing called the Student Data Privacy Consortium, which could be used to make that list. And John Lyman, I'm going to pass it over him for just a moment, as he's waving at you to talk about that real quick.
I'm so animated. Good morning. I would like to invite all of you to request an onboarding or a refresher of the Student Data Privacy Consortium, or SDPC. This is the website that can house all of your agreements with third parties. Together with the website, we can help you meet all of the requirements of the metadata dictionary. So yes, Clint, we can do that. So far, we have 83 agencies actively participating. If you are participating in SDPC, help me sing its praises in the chat. And if you have yet to schedule an onboarding to join SDPC and the Utah Student Privacy Alliance, please reach out and I'll schedule a time to meet with you. Even if you've already had an onboarding, but the realities of day-to-day life have put this project on your back burner, don't fret. I love doing refreshers, and we are continually developing tools to support you in every step of this process. Let's work together to get you a comprehensive and compliant. Send me an email and let's get rolling.
Thank you, John. Okay, and then one of the last ones that's in the board rule relates to adoption of that cybersecurity framework. The Center for Internet Security is CIS. So they have a list of 20 controls that are in priority order, and that's also broken down even more so into what they call implementation groups. So implementation group 1 is like the basic stuff you should be starting with, and control groups 1 through 6 are the basics of the 20. So what we are going to ask for is, and this is really more of just wanting to understand, where are you at with those? So we intend to send out a survey to the information security officers. That'll be on the next slide, actually, but of where are you at? And then also wanting to understand, what is your goal? So essentially your current profile and your target profile, where do you hope to be a year from now? What are you actively trying to accomplish? And this is one, again, that I'm going to say we're not, compared to like the annual FERPA notice, where those of you who've been through it, where it's like, hey, you legally have to mention the school official exception. You know, how are you determining who is a student, a school official with legitimate educational interest? That has to be in your notice. This is one where, again, like I said, we mostly just want to understand what is the current state. So again, hopefully we can help provide more resources, work with UETN to provide more helpful resources as well. And so that's what I should say. This we intend to be something separate from this October 1 collection. We will be reaching out with the LEA's information security officers directly in a separate survey to collect this information. So if that is your role, you should expect to hear more on that later. Okay, as I said earlier, this is a lot of information. Our data manager page is a good place to go. It discusses this in not as much detail, but it includes model documents for pretty much everything I've talked about. We also have a Canvas course for data managers. I'm not sure if you are aware of this. We are working to update this right now. This is actually, one of Katie's early tasks. Updating this right now in order to go over everything I just said in step-by-step detail to help you accomplish that. That's not ready for 2021 just yet, but keep an eye out in our newsletter. We'll let you know once it is available. So with that said, it's over. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to pass it over to John, who has been keeping track of questions and other things in the chat, and we'll close out by going over those. John.
Thanks a bunch, David. Thank you to everybody in the chat saying happy birthday to me tomorrow. I appreciate that. What you see here, hopefully all of you are, well, let me link to it right there. Okay, so you all can join me looking at our closing document. I've also provided the survey link to, that is your exit ticket today, is filling out that survey. Also, I've relinked us to the privacy newsletter, as you can see on your screen, hopefully. We are displaying our closing document. That's all of our contact information. And let's jump down to these questions. Anonymous posted, now that gender/sex discussions are more protected than it was many years ago, combine that with Aspire moving towards offering 2 categories of sex and gender on the state SIS. I'm wondering if someone at USB might be able to review reports that are being pulled and determine whether sex, gender still needs to be included on those reports. For example, does sex or gender need to be included on an attendance report? We're starting to have multiple discussions on the SSID side as we're redoing SSID stuff with the USIMS project. And these are the kinds of reports that go maybe to a substitute teacher. This person has brought it up with the USIMS team, but they think it's much bigger than that. So they don't know if any reports include it. And I think that they would like our guidance on this.
So I saw this question a while ago, and it came up at least in the PPRA discussion. And I think there are some interesting questions that are going to be really hard to answer just, in the couple of minutes that we have here to answer questions. But I think it is good to have on our awareness. Again, PPRA, which gets at, those kind of psychological examinations when you are asking them of a student, psychological examinations, evaluations, surveys. And correct me if I'm wrong, these aren't, I don't think, triggering PPRA, Utah FERPA in that regard, because you're not populating those fields by surveying students, is my guess. When we're talking about like gender identification, for example, you're not giving students a survey saying, hey, if you identify as something other than your biological or your birth sex, will you please let us know in this survey so we can update our SIS? If you were doing that, it probably would trigger PPRA in Utah FERPA and probably worry a lot of parents. But if it's most of the situations I've heard about are where parents are reaching out and requesting that the school make a change. And that wouldn't cover then PPRA Utah FERPA. Those are only triggered if you are soliciting the information from a student. You can get information from a parent, or a parent can ask for information there. So this is definitely like hitting on our law a little bit, but outside of like just making that PPRA Utah FERPA point, I think you're right. This is it's bigger than PPRA, it's bigger than USIMS. And I think it's good to have on our radar, but I'm not really prepared to say more than that on just the legal side of the privacy laws.
Holly Allen asks, if we do a Canvas course for teachers on data privacy, can they count that towards licensure hours if they take it?
Yeah, I was going to say, this is another one we need to talk with our licensing team about that. So that's another good one to have where it's like, that's a great question. Let's find out.
And then we will be updating this document too with the answers, and we're sending that out with our newsletter. We regularly do surveys to try to ascertain a student's disposition and or attitude towards various educational standards. Thoughts?
Okay, yeah, and I'll say this is one that came to me during the PPRA presentation as well. And I think of it in terms of, when you say ascertaining student political beliefs or attitudes, and it's hard because it just feels like everything can become political nowadays. And it's like, well, are some educational standards overtly political? And the answer is maybe. The answer I think is probably most reasonable in this case is, I think you, in running a school and running a district, are within reason to ask parents, to ask students if educational things are working for them. And so the answer I gave, because this was in a direct message on this, was essentially, I think if you're just doing that, it's probably fine. Unless you frame the question in overtly political ways. If it was something like, hey, what do you think of the Democrats' plan to have this thing in education, right? I think once you start like where it's very clearly like tying a political component to it, versus, and I don't know, if we have a specific example of like an educational standard where we feel like, I don't know, that might be having a student reveal political information. I'll also say that the wording in Utah FERPA does relate to, it says where the evident intended effect is to get a student to reveal, in this case, their political beliefs. I don't think that, just asking about educational standards necessarily is asking a student that has the evident intended effect of having a student reveal their political beliefs. So I'd say if there's a question, if you have a survey question where you're like, hey, we think this one might be crossing a line, it's definitely worth running past your legal counsel. You can send it to us and we can take a look at it as well. But that's again, I think the simplest way to answer that question.
Do vaccinations trigger the PPRA invasive physical examination requirement?
Yeah, I added this one to the questions list because this is one that did not necessarily, no one specifically asked the question, but there was some chat when Whitney brought up the physical examinations. as to, hey, would this cover it? And so actually, I just wanted to share the exact wording from the law. So if I can share my screen real quick, John.
Yeah.
So, okay. So the issue with this, because Whitney referenced where it's like, we've racked our brains trying to think of what might actually trigger this requirement. And we also spoke with the USB has a student health, a student nurse specialist. And we sent her the question and she just responded with, what on earth are you talking about? And a lot of it is because so this portion of the law, I think, actually came in under No Child Left Behind. And if you look at the wording in the law, there's so many exceptions is what the issue becomes. And that's where we're like, well, we don't understand when this would be triggered. So first of all, if we look at the definition of invasive physical examination in the law, so it could be lots of things. Any medical examination that involves the exposure of private body parts, or any act during such examination that includes incision, insertion, or injection into the body, but doesn't include hearing, vision, or scoliosis screening, which does make me wonder, what kind of vision screening are you doing that involves incision? But if you had one, it's not covered by this. Okay, so the big ones, hearing, vision, scoliosis, those are always accepted. Has to involve exposure, incision, insertion, or injection. Okay, so next requirements, has to be non-emergency. Okay, and because I think someone mentioned COVID vaccinations, and it's like, well, that's kind of hard to say. You could make the argument, we still have emergency executive orders in place. So that non-emergency one is one of the standards. Then has to be required as a condition of attendance. And this is the one that really throws me off, because if you don't require it as a condition of attendance, or it's optional, as is the case with most vaccinations in the state, doesn't trigger the requirement. So it's only if you are requiring it. If you are saying you have to get this invasive physical examination or you do not get to attend our school, those are the ones you have to notify parents of. Also, it has to be administered by the school. So if it's being administered by a doctor or someplace off-site, doesn't trigger the requirement, and scheduled by the school in advance, which is interesting because it does sound like if you just wanted to sneakily do this without any notice, it doesn't trigger the requirement, which I think is maybe an unintended loophole. But then also it has to be that non-emergency thing, not necessary to protect the immediate health and safety of the student or other students. And on top of all of that, as we talk about vaccinations, there is a state law exception, and you can see it here in B2. These do not apply to anything that is either permitted or required in state law. State law, as you're aware, has various requirements regarding vaccinating students, not specifically with COVID immunizations, but I actually got the notification from my soon-to-be 7th graders school, where it's like, hey, we need to have these vaccinations on record in order for your kid to attend. So I guess therein is the thing, as you look at all of that, we racked our brains. We're just like, well, I don't know what all would cover this specific requirement. And as you're aware, with immunizations in general in the state, yes, they're required as attendance, but parents do have a procedure in which they can, essentially object, opt out of it. But I don't see those as necessarily triggering PPRA because there is a state requirement. So it's such a strange requirement in the law, and you do have to have a policy under PPRA that says how you're going to handle this. But I can't think of what would ever trigger this requirement. But as Whitney said, an hour or so ago, if you all can think of something, let us know, because we haven't come up with anything yet. All right, going to give it back to John.
Alex asks, for the PPRA, do the state Qualtrics surveys fall under its authority?
Yes. We have these conversations, particularly regarding like the climate survey. We read all the questions in the climate survey. And I think that's a really good example of one where it's like, it's when you get too personal. I think it's fine, to ask a student, what sections of the school building have you seen bullying, or do you not feel safe? that's not asking about, self-incriminating behavior necessarily, or even necessarily, a mental health problem. The state one asks about sexting. Well, thanks, Holly. I maybe missed that one. I think, yeah, and Holly, you're right. Like NCLB was a different time. Even during NCLB, I don't even know what was happening in 2002, where like it's just so many exceptions. I'm not sure what necessarily is coming to it. But ultimately, yes, if it's a survey that is being administered, if in the case of like the climate survey, if it's being administered by you, if you are the one distributing it, then the Utah FERPA requirements would trigger. I think the most classic example of this is going to be the SHARP survey. And as you're aware, that only occurs with written parental consent. But yes, the method doesn't matter. Qualtrics surveys, I think it's going to make it so these questions come up more as to, hey, is this okay under PPRA? Because we just have a really powerful survey tool.
Thank you. Pamela asks, lastly, does federal law still require a student's disciplinary records with respect to suspensions or expulsions of 10 or more days school when transferring student records to another school?
This is a good question. I see no one else wanted to jump in quickly. I think we'd probably want to do a little bit of research on this one because we don't get asked about it a lot. I am aware that, there was the requirement in Utah law that we did have this changed last year, where you were required to list on the student's transcript suspensions and expulsions. But we had the language changed to just have it be in the cumulative folder. We felt like transcripts were used for potentially more than just school purposes, that those things might be shared with universities, potential future employers, things like that. So I believe there still is some kind of requirement, but I don't know the details. So that's one we'll have to get back to you on.
As you can, go ahead.
To add to that, David, we did define cumulative folder within board rules, so we'll get that linked to you. I can look that up while we're finishing up.
And while we're finishing up, we have this survey link here. So for the 30 or so of you that are on the closing document, you can click on that. It's also linked in the chat. We also have all the links from Whitney's data collection laws, from Katie's privacy and play, and from David's legislative updates and compliance preps. We have some action items for you here. Please subscribe to our newsletter. This is the survey again, should you need a third link. All of our updated YouTube links have migrated to a new channel. So if you are using any of our YouTube videos produced within the last year plus, please find their new home here. Any training requests for SDPC or for any privacy trainings that Katie had mentioned, you can find us here at privacy@schools.utah.gov. And then lastly, these are other resources developed by our team. This is our Security for Teachers, starring David Soleil as Agent FERPA. If you clicked on that link, it'll take you to a 6-part series on security for teachers. This is a records management that we produced over the summer. This is for educational records officers. You can click on this link. That is Avalon. She is your liaison at State Archives, and she will walk you through all of the things that you need to know about state records, state education records, and grandma requests. And then lastly, we have our Utah Ramp, which was released last year on this day. It is the retention schedule for all of Utah's educational records. It gives you the appraisal and management tools that you need in order to manage all of your different records. And then we have one last question from Alex in the chat. Is there any requirement coming from the legislature or board rule regarding birth certificates? And with that, I will segue over to Whitney and or David for our closing.
To ask a question about birth certificate, answer that, or?
Yes, please do.
I know there were some questions about that. I think our AGs wrote something about it. We'll get their wording.
And I will add that to the questions list. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, David, and thank you for all for joining us. We're ending just a few minutes early. As John said, please subscribe to the newsletter to get a recording and also this closing document. And please take the survey link and let us know what you liked, what you would like more of, and I'll leave you with 4 minutes of more of your day. Have a great day.